Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, Shattered Glass. Grant Anthony stared at the hospital ceiling, counting the tiles for the 100th time. 48 hours had passed since the accident, and the sterile white squares above him had become a cruel calendar marking time he'd never get back. His son Harry lay motionless in the bed beside him, machines keeping rhythm with a heart that had fought so hard to keep beating. At 34, Grant had built himself into something unbreakable. 6'2", broad shoulders earned from years of construction work before he transitioned into project management. Hands that could fix anything except the one thing that mattered most. His colleagues at Morrison Construction respected him not just for his technical expertise, but for his ability to solve problems others couldn't even see coming. He was the man who anticipated structural failures before they happened, who could read blueprints like poetry and find flaws in seemingly perfect designs. But none of that mattered now. Harry Anthony had been riding his bike home from his best friend Tommy's house when the drunk driver ran the red light. The impact sent the 9-year-old flying 30 feet, his small body crumpling like the bicycle that now lay twisted in some police impound lot. The driver, a repeat offender named Marcus Vince, had stumbled out of his car unharmed, reeking of whiskey and legal loopholes. Mr. Anthony? Dr. Patricia Wells entered quietly, her expression telling the story before her words could. "I'm sorry. We've done everything we can." Grant's wife, Sarah, sobbed into his chest as he held her, his own tears falling silently into her auburn hair. They'd been married 8 years, having met when Sarah was fresh out of nursing school, and Grant was working his way up from framing houses to managing entire developments. She'd seen his potential when he was still wearing work boots, caked in mud, believing in him when he decided to go back to school for his engineering degree. Harry had been their miracle child, born after 3 miscarriages that had nearly broken them both. Sarah couldn't have more children after Harry's difficult birth, making their son not just their first child, but their only chance at the family they dreamed of building together. The boy had inherited Grant's analytical mind and Sarah's compassionate heart. At 9, Harry was already showing signs of following in his father's footsteps, building elaborate structures with Legos and asking detailed questions about how buildings stayed standing. But more than that, he was kind. The type of kid who gave his lunch money to classmates who forgot theirs and brought injured animals home for Sarah to nurse back to health. Now he was gone, and Grant felt something fundamental shift inside him. The man who had spent his career preventing disasters had failed to protect the one thing that mattered most. As he signed the papers to donate Harry's organs, something Harry had asked about after seeing a commercial about it, Grant made a silent promise to his son. Justice would come, one way or another. Chapter 2, Words that Cut Deeper Than Knives. St. Michael's Catholic Church had never felt smaller. Grant stood at the front of the sanctuary, his black suit a stark contrast to the small white casket that seemed impossibly tiny beneath the stained glass windows. Sarah sat in the front pew, supported by her sister Dawn Godfrey, who had flown in from Seattle the moment she heard. The church was packed. Harry's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, sat with several of his classmates and their parents. Grant's crew from Morrison Construction filled an entire section, rough men in uncomfortable suits who'd taken the day off to pay their respects. Even Mr. Chun from the corner store where Harry bought comic books had come, clutching a Batman figure he'd saved for the boy. But it was the family section that made Grant's jaw clench. His mother-in-law, Pearl Hamilton, sat with her lips pursed in disapproval, as if even grief was something she found distasteful. Next to her was her daughter-in-law, Valerie Hamilton, Pearl's son Jerome's wife, whom everyone called Belly, though Grant had never been sure why. Jerome himself was conspicuously absent, claiming work obligations, though Grant suspected he was at the casino as usual. The service proceeded with Father McKenna reading from Scripture, sharing memories of Harry's short but impactful life. Sarah's tears flowed steadily, but Grant remained dry-eyed, his grief crystallized into something harder and colder. He'd cried enough in the hospital. Now he needed to be strong for Sarah, and more importantly, he needed to remember everything. Tommy Martinez, Harry's best friend, had been permitted to speak by his parents. The 8-year-old walked slowly to the podium, barely tall enough to reach the microphone. "Harry was my best friend," Tommy began, his voice small but clear. "He was really smart and really nice. He helped me with math homework and let me borrow his Nintendo games. He was going to be an engineer like his dad and build the tallest building in the world." Grant felt his throat tighten as Tommy continued, sharing memories of summer adventures and sleepovers of two boys who'd planned to be friends forever. As Tommy returned to his seat, Pearl Hamilton rose from her pew. Grant watched her approach the podium with growing unease. Pearl had never approved of Sarah marrying a construction worker who came from common stock. Even after Grant had earned his engineering degree and built his reputation, she'd found reasons to criticize him. "We gather today to mourn the loss of young Harry," Pearl began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "But in times like these, we must also remember that God works in mysterious ways. Perhaps," she paused, her cold gray eyes finding Grant's face, "perhaps this is his way of ending bad bloodlines before they can continue." The church fell dead silent. Grant felt the words hit him like physical blows, each syllable carefully chosen to wound. Around him, he could see several family members nodding in agreement, including his brother-in-law Craig Hamilton and his wife Miriam Thompson Hamilton. But Pearl wasn't finished. "Sometimes," she continued, her voice gaining strength from the murmurs of agreement, "God sees things we cannot. Some children are better off not growing up in this broken world, especially when they come from." Her eyes swept over Grant dismissively. Questionable circumstances. Grant's hands clenched into fists, but before he could respond, Tommy Martinez stood up in his pew. The 8-year-old's face was flushed with anger that seemed far too mature for his years. "That's not true," Tommy shouted, his young voice echoing through the church. "Harry was the best person I knew. And if you want to talk about bad people, should I tell everyone what Aunt Belly did to Harry before he died?" The funeral home went dead silent. Valerie Hamilton's face went white as paper. Pearl's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Grant felt every muscle in his body tense as he processed what he'd just heard. What had Valerie done to his son? Tommy's parents quickly pulled their son back down into the pew, whispering urgently in his ear. Father McKenna cleared his throat and attempted to restore order, but the damage was done. The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. Grant's eyes locked onto Valerie's face, reading fear and guilt in her expression as clearly as he could read architectural blueprints. Whatever Tommy knew, whatever Valerie had done to Harry, it was real, and Grant intended to find out exactly what it was. As the service concluded and people began to file out, offering hollow condolences and avoiding eye contact, Grant made his second promise to his son. He would uncover the truth, and then everyone who had hurt Harry, in life or in death, would face the consequences. The funeral was over, but Grant's work was just beginning. Chapter 3: Unraveling Threads. The reception at the Hamilton family home was a study in forced civility. Grant moved through the crowd like a predator among prey, his grief temporarily overshadowed by a burning need for answers. Sarah stayed close to Dawn, accepting condolences with the vacant politeness of the deeply wounded, while Grant observed and listened. Valerie Hamilton had disappeared shortly after Tommy's outburst, claiming she needed to check on something in the kitchen. But Grant had watched her slip out the back door, phone pressed to her ear, her voice urgent and low. He'd given her a 5-minute head start before following. The Hamilton backyard was a monument to suburban conformity. Perfectly manicured lawn, regulation flower beds, and a gazebo that Pearl had insisted would add property value. Grant found Valerie pacing near the garden shed, her conversation growing more heated by the second. "Told you this would come back to bite us," she was saying. "The kid saw everything, Jerome. What if he talks?" Grant stepped closer, using the shed as cover. Years of construction sites had taught him how to move quietly. "I don't care about your gambling debts," Valerie continued. "We have bigger problems now. If Grant finds out what really happened." She paused, listening, then exploded. Don't you dare try to pin this all on me. You were the one who said we needed to teach the little brat a lesson. Another pause. Fine, but if this goes sideways, I'm not going down alone. Grant's blood turned to ice. Whatever they'd done to Harry, it had been intentional. Planned. He pulled out his phone and started recording, but Valerie was already hanging up, her face pale and panicked. She turned and nearly walked into Grant's chest. Oh, Grant, I was just getting some air. The house is so stuffy, and with all the people. What did you do to my son, Valerie? The question hung between them like a blade. Valerie's eyes darted left and right, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. I don't know what you mean. That boy's obviously traumatized and saying things. Tommy Martinez is the most honest kid I've ever met. He doesn't lie, and he doesn't make things up. So I'll ask you again, what did you do to Harry? For a moment, Grant thought she might confess. Her lower lip trembled, and tears formed in her eyes. But then her expression hardened, and she lifted her chin defiantly. Your son was a spoiled little brat who thought he was better than everyone else. Just like his father. Maybe if you'd taught him some respect. Grant stepped forward, and Valerie immediately stepped back, bumping into the shed door. Careful, Valerie. You're at my son's funeral, in front of my wife's family, and you've just admitted you had a problem with a 9-year-old child. I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Valerie's bravado crumbled. It wasn't supposed to hurt him, she whispered. Jerome said we just needed to scare him, teach him not to run his mouth about things he didn't understand. What things? Valerie's mouth snapped shut. She'd said too much already, and they both knew it. This conversation isn't over, Grant said quietly. And Valerie? If I find out you or Jerome laid one finger on my boy, there won't be a hole deep enough for you to hide in. He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Valerie shaking by the garden shed. His mind was already working, processing the fragments of information like pieces of a complex blueprint. Harry had seen something he shouldn't have. Jerome had gambling debts, and somehow that had led to them deciding to teach a lesson to a 9-year-old boy. Inside the house, Grant found Tommy Martinez sitting alone on the back porch, his small frame hunched with the weight of adult secrets. Hey, Tommy. The boy looked up, his eyes red from crying. Mr. Anthony? I'm sorry I yelled in church. My mom said I shouldn't have done that. Grant sat down beside him, his voice gentle. You don't need to apologize for telling the truth, son. Can you tell me what you saw? What did Aunt Belly do to Harry? Tommy looked around nervously, then scooted closer to Grant. It was last week when Harry was walking home from my house. I forgot to give him back his Pokemon cards, so I ran after him. That's when I saw her. What did you see? She was with that mean man. Harry said it was Uncle Jerome. They were waiting by Mr. Peterson's fence, and when Harry walked by, Uncle Jerome grabbed him really hard. He was shaking him and yelling about keeping his mouth shut about things that weren't his business. Grant's vision darkened around the edges. Did they hurt him? Uncle Jerome pushed him down real hard. Harry scraped his knee on the sidewalk, and his backpack got torn. But that's not the worst part. Tommy's voice dropped to a whisper. Aunt Belly said if Harry ever told anyone what he saw at the casino, they'd make sure something really bad happened to him. The casino. Jerome's gambling debts. Harry seeing something he shouldn't have. Tommy, what did Harry see at the casino? The boy's eyes widened with fear. I can't tell you that, Mr. Anthony. Harry made me promise not to tell anyone, even after what happened to him. Grant knelt down at Tommy's eye level. Son, Harry can't be hurt anymore. But the people who threatened him are still out there. If you help me, I can make sure they never hurt another kid the way they hurt Harry. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Harry saw Uncle Jerome with some bad men at the casino. They were giving him money, but Harry said something wasn't right about it. He heard them talking about fixing something, and Uncle Jerome was writing stuff down on papers. Match fixing, or perhaps something worse. Jerome Hamilton was in debt to the wrong people and had gotten involved in something illegal. When Harry witnessed it, Jerome and Valerie had decided the 9-year-old was a liability. 3 days later, Harry was dead. Grant stood up slowly, his mind already formulating a plan. Jerome thought he was safe, hiding behind his mother's money and his wife's lies. But Grant had built a career on finding structural weaknesses and exploiting them. It was time to bring down the house of cards Jerome had built, one carefully placed pressure point at a time. Chapter 4. The Foundation Cracks. Grant's home office had been transformed into a war room. The walls were covered with printouts, photographs, and handwritten notes connected by red string like a detective's conspiracy board. Sarah had retreated to her sister's house in Seattle, unable to bear being in the house where Harry's laughter still echoed from every corner. Grant had encouraged her to go, knowing what he was planning would be easier to execute without worrying about her safety. It had been a week since the funeral, and Grant had used every hour to build his case. His years in construction had taught him that every structure had vulnerable points. You just had to know where to look and how much pressure to apply. Jerome Hamilton's life was a house of cards built on a foundation of lies, and Grant was methodically identifying each weak spot. The first breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Ed Pham, Grant's poker buddy who worked in IT for the State Gaming Commission. Over beers at Murphy's Tavern, Grant had casually mentioned Jerome's frequent casino visits. Jerome Hamilton? Ed had frowned. Tall guy, thinning hair, always wearing those cheap suits? Yeah, we've been watching him. He's been flagged for suspicious betting patterns at 3 different casinos. Suspicious how? The kind that suggests he's got inside information on fixed games. Nothing we can prove yet, but the pattern is there. What? Grant had shrugged, keeping his voice casual. Just curious. Guy's married to my sister-in-law. Now, armed with that information, Grant was digging deeper. He'd spent the morning at the county courthouse, poring over public records. Jerome's financial situation was even worse than Grant had suspected. 3 mortgages on the family home, maxed out credit cards, and a trail of small loans from increasingly dubious sources. But it was the property records that provided the most interesting revelation. Jerome had recently taken out a 4th mortgage on his mother's house, without Pearl's knowledge, if the forged signatures were any indication. Grant photographed everything, building a comprehensive file of Jerome's crimes. But financial fraud wasn't enough. He needed evidence of what they'd done to Harry. His phone buzzed with a text from Tommy Martinez's mother. Tommy wants to tell you something else. Can you come by after school? An hour later, Grant sat in the Martinez family living room, waiting as 8-year-old Tommy gathered his courage. Harry showed me something before he died, Tommy finally said. He said he was scared, but he didn't know who to tell. The boy disappeared into his bedroom and returned with a small digital camera, the kind kids use for school projects. Harry gave me this the day before what happened. He said if something bad happened to him, I should give it to you. Grant's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the camera. The first few photos were typical kid shots, playground antics, pictures of pets, selfies with Tommy. But then he found them. 3 clear photographs of Jerome Hamilton meeting with 2 men in an alley behind the Riverside Casino. The timestamp showed they were taken the week before Harry's death. In the first photo, one of the men was handing Jerome a thick envelope. In the second, Jerome was showing them some kind of document. In the third, the most damning, Jerome was photographed accepting what appeared to be a substantial amount of cash. Harry said he followed Uncle Jerome because he heard him and Aunt Belly fighting about money. Tommy explained. He wanted to help, but when he saw those men, he got scared and hid. He said they looked mean. Grant recognized the men from mug shots he'd found online. Marcus Delacroix and his enforcer, Tony the Brick Salvatore, mid-level criminals with connections to illegal gambling operations throughout the state. If Jerome was taking money from them, he was in deeper than simple gambling addiction. Tommy, did Harry ever tell you what was on the papers Jerome was showing these men? The boy nodded. Harry was really good at reading upside down. He said it looked like lists of names and numbers, like maybe sports teams or something. Harry thought Uncle Jerome might be cheating at games. Point shaving. Jerome was providing inside information about local sports events to fixers, taking payment from organized crime figures, and using his access to Pearl's social circles to gather intelligence on which games were most vulnerable to manipulation. Grant's engineering mind began constructing the perfect collapse. Jerome's house of cards was more precarious than he'd realized, and Grant now had the leverage to bring it all down. But he needed one more piece of the puzzle. That evening, Grant drove to the Riverside Casino. He wasn't there to gamble. He was there to observe. Using the techniques he'd learned from years of accident investigation, he positioned himself where he could watch the security cameras and staff rotations. Within an hour, he'd identified the inside man Jerome was working with, Stanley Kinney, a pit boss with access to game schedules and player information. Grant photographed Stanley meeting with Jerome in the parking lot, exchanging what appeared to be folded papers for an envelope. The picture was becoming clear. Jerome was providing Stanley with information about which players would be at which tables, allowing the fixers to target specific games. In return, he received payment from Delacroix's organization, money he desperately needed to service his growing debts. Harry had witnessed one of these exchanges and, being an intelligent kid, had realized something wasn't right. Jerome and Valerie's solution had been to threaten a 9-year-old into silence. 3 days later, Harry was dead in a random accident. Grant drove home through the rain, his mind working like a precision instrument. He had evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and intimidation. He had photographs, financial records, and witness testimony. Most importantly, he had a plan that would ensure Jerome, Valerie, and everyone who had hurt Harry would face justice. But not the kind of justice that came from courtrooms and lawyers. Grant had spent his career building things that lasted. Now, he was going to engineer the perfect demolition. As he pulled into his empty driveway, Grant looked up at Harry's bedroom window and made his final promise to his son. "I'm going to take them all down, buddy. Every single one of them." The foundation work was complete. Now, it was time to start applying pressure to the structural weak points. Chapter 5. Engineering the Perfect Storm. Grant's alarm went off at 4:30 a.m., but he'd already been awake for an hour, his mind running calculations like a computer processing complex equations. Today marked the beginning of the endgame, and every detail had to be perfect. The first call came at 5:15 a.m., right on schedule. Grant answered on the second ring, keeping his voice groggy and confused. "Grant? It's Detective Reynolds. I'm sorry to call so early, but we need to talk about your son's case." Detective Janet Reynolds was a 20-year veteran of the police force, known for her methodical approach to cold cases. Grant had met her once during the initial investigation into Harry's death, noting her sharp intellect and unwillingness to accept simple explanations. "Of course, Detective. Has something new come up?" "Several things, actually. Can you meet me at the station this morning? There are some developments you need to know about." Grant had spent 2 weeks carefully cultivating Detective Reynolds' interest in Harry's case, feeding her information in ways that seemed coincidental. A chance encounter at the coffee shop where he'd mentioned his concerns about Jerome's behavior. A casual comment about Tommy Martinez having more information than he'd initially shared. Seeds planted with the patience of an experienced engineer. At the police station, Detective Reynolds led Grant to a small conference room where files and photographs covered every available surface. "Mr. Anthony, I've been reviewing your son's death, and I'm starting to have questions about the timeline. Specifically, about what happened in the days leading up to the accident." She spread out a series of photographs, crime scene shots, traffic camera footage, and witness statements. Tommy Martinez finally felt comfortable enough to give us a formal statement about what he witnessed. He's also provided us with some very interesting photographs. Grant examined the images, allowing his face to show the appropriate shock and recognition. "That's Jerome, my sister-in-law's husband. Who are those men with him?" "Marcus Delacroix and Anthony Salvatore. Both have extensive criminal records related to illegal gambling operations. According to our investigation, they've been running a point-shaving scheme involving college basketball games, and your brother-in-law appears to be their inside man at several casinos." Detective Reynolds leaned forward. "Here's where it gets interesting. Jerome Hamilton has significant gambling debts, over $200,000 according to our financial investigation. He's been working with these men to fix games, providing inside information in exchange for debt relief and cash payments. But what does this have to do with Harry?" According to Tommy's statement, Harry witnessed one of these exchanges and photographed it. 3 days later, Jerome and his wife confronted Harry, threatening him if he talked about what he'd seen. Grant's jaw clenched with genuine emotion. "They threatened my son?" "It appears so. And Mr. Anthony. Detective Reynolds paused, choosing her words carefully. We've been investigating the circumstances of Harry's accident. The driver who hit him, Marcus Vince, has connections to the same criminal network your brother-in-law was involved with. This was the piece Grant hadn't expected, the one variable he hadn't accounted for in his calculations. Are you saying Harry's death wasn't an accident? I'm saying we're treating it as a homicide investigation now. Jerome Hamilton, Valerie Hamilton, and several others are going to be arrested today on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit fraud to accessory to murder. Grant allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Phase 1 of his plan was complete, but it was only the beginning. That afternoon, Grant received a call from Dawn Godfrey, Sarah's sister in Seattle. Grant, I just saw the news. Jerome and Valerie were arrested? What's going on? The police discovered they were involved in illegal gambling operations. It looks like Harry might have witnessed something he shouldn't have. There was a long pause. Grant, Sarah doesn't know yet. She's been doing so well in therapy, starting to process the grief in a healthy way. This is going to devastate her. Then don't tell her yet. Let the legal process run its course first. Another pause. Grant, there's something else. Pearl called me this morning, completely hysterical. Apparently, Jerome had taken out loans against her house without her knowledge. She's facing foreclosure. Perfect. Grant had been counting on this development. That's terrible. Pearl's been through so much already. She's asking family members to help with the mortgage payments. I know money is tight for you and Sarah right now, but actually, I might be able to help. I've been looking into some investment opportunities. Real estate, specifically. That evening, Grant met with his lawyer, Philip Conway, at his downtown office. Philip had been a friend since college, before Grant had switched from pre-law to engineering. Now he ran a successful practice specializing in commercial real estate and contract law. You want to buy Pearl Hamilton's house? Philip asked, reviewing the documents Grant had provided. The same Pearl Hamilton who made those comments at your son's funeral? It's a solid investment. The house is worth at least $400,000, but with the foreclosure proceedings, I can probably get it for $250,000. Property values in that neighborhood are only going to increase. Philip studied the paperwork more carefully. Grant, this is your mother-in-law's house. Even if it's a good investment, the family dynamics will work themselves out. Pearl needs money to save her house. I have money to lend. It's a simple business transaction. And the fact that you'll own the mortgage on the house where the woman who insulted your dead son lives. Grant's smile was cold and calculating. Like I said, Phil, property values are only going to increase. 3 hours later, Grant had the contracts drawn up and signed. Pearl Hamilton, desperate to save her home and avoid homelessness at 73, had agreed to terms that were far more favorable to Grant than to her. But the house was only the first domino. Grant's real target was the entire Hamilton family structure, and he was just getting started. As he drove home past the cemetery where Harry was buried, Grant rolled down the windows and let the cool evening air fill the car. Phase 2 complete, buddy, he said softly. Tomorrow we start building the future you deserve to see. Chapter 6, The Architecture of Justice. Grant stood in Pearl Hamilton's living room, surveying the space with the calculating eye of a professional. The house was a 1960s colonial with good bones, but decades of deferred maintenance. The hardwood floors were warped in several places, the electrical system was outdated, and the plumbing made concerning noises when water ran through the pipes. As I explained on the phone, Mrs. Hamilton, the house needs significant work to meet current safety codes, Grant said, consulting his clipboard of inspection notes. The electrical panel is a fire hazard, the foundation has settling issues, and don't get me started on the asbestos in the basement insulation. Pearl Hamilton sat rigidly in her favorite chair, the same one she'd occupied during family gatherings where she'd made cutting remarks about Grant's background and prospects. At 73, she was still a formidable woman, but the arrest of her son and the financial crisis had aged her considerably. I don't have money for repairs, Grant. You know that. That's why I had to sell you the mortgage in the first place. I understand your position, but as the new mortgage holder, I have certain responsibilities to maintain the property value. The city inspector is coming next week, and if these issues aren't addressed, we could be looking at condemnation proceedings. This was a lie, but Pearl didn't know that. Grant had learned long ago that fear was a powerful motivator, and Pearl Hamilton was afraid of losing the only home she'd ever known. What are you suggesting? Grant consulted his notes again, drawing out the moment. The repairs will cost approximately $85,000. That's more than the current equity you have in the house. However, I might be willing to cover the costs in exchange for certain adjustments to our agreement. What kind of adjustments? I'll handle all the repairs and improvements at my own expense. In exchange, I'll need you to sign over full ownership of the property to me. You can continue living here rent-free for as long as you maintain the property according to my specifications. Pearl's face went white. You want me to sign over my house? I want to help you, Mrs. Hamilton. The alternative is foreclosure, and at your age, finding affordable housing will be challenging. Grant watched Pearl process the implications. She was trapped, and they both knew it. Without her son's income and facing massive legal bills, she had no other options. The house that had been her source of pride and security was now an anchor dragging her down. I'll need time to think about it. Of course, but the city inspection is scheduled for next Wednesday. If the violations aren't addressed by then, Grant left the sentence hanging as he gathered his papers. Pearl Hamilton, who had spent years looking down on him as beneath her family's standards, was now completely dependent on his mercy. And Grant was fresh out of mercy for people who had hurt his son. That evening, Grant met Craig Carr at Donovan's Steakhouse, one of the city's most expensive restaurants. Craig was Jerome's gambling buddy and, according to Grant's investigation, another small player in the point-shaving scheme that had gotten Harry killed. Grant, man, I can't believe what happened to Jerome and Valerie. This whole thing is insane. Craig cut into his steak nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the dinner invitation. It's certainly been a shock to the family. But I asked you here because I think you might be able to help with something. Help with what? Grant signaled the waiter for another bottle of wine, keeping his voice casual. Jerome's legal troubles are going to be expensive. The family is trying to raise money for his defense, and I know you two were close. I was hoping you might consider contributing to his legal fund. Craig nearly choked on his wine. Grant, I'm flattered you'd ask, but I don't really have that kind of money. That's interesting, because according to the bank records the police subpoenaed, you made several large cash deposits over the past 6 months. Deposits that correspond exactly with the dates Jerome was receiving payments from his gambling contacts. The color drained from Craig's face. I don't know what you're talking about. Grant smiled pleasantly and pulled out a manila folder. Photo surveillance from the Riverside Casino showing you meeting with Stanley Kenny. Financial records showing payments from offshore accounts linked to Marcus Delacroix. And most importantly, cell phone records showing you called Jerome 15 minutes before Harry's accident. Craig's hand trembled as he reached for his wine glass. What do you want? I want you to disappear, Craig. Tonight, pack a bag, get in your car, and drive until you run out of road. Because tomorrow morning, I'm turning all of this evidence over to Detective Reynolds, and she's going to have some very pointed questions about your role in my son's death. I didn't know they were going to hurt the kid, Grant. I swear to God, I thought they were just going to scare him. The admission hung between them like a death sentence. Craig had just confessed to prior knowledge of the threat against Harry. You had a choice, Craig. You could have warned me, called the police, or simply walked away from Jerome's scheme. Instead, you chose money over the life of a 9-year-old boy. Grant stood up and dropped $200 bills on the table. You've got a 12-hour head start. I suggest you use it wisely. As Craig stumbled out of the restaurant, Grant felt the satisfaction of another domino falling. By morning, Craig would be running, adding another fugitive charge to his growing legal problems and eliminating Jerome's most important witness. The next day brought the news Grant had been expecting. Miriam Thompson Hamilton, Jerome's sister-in-law, called in a panic. Grant, I just heard about Craig disappearing. The police think he was involved in Jerome's gambling scheme. This is getting worse by the day. I'm sure it will all work out, Miriam. But that's not why I'm calling. Phil has been arrested. Grant allowed himself a moment of confusion. Phil who? Phil O'Neill, Pearl's financial advisor. Apparently, he's been embezzling money from her investment accounts for years. Pearl just found out she's lost almost everything. This was unexpected, but convenient. Grant had been planning to target Phil eventually, but having him arrested for separate crimes saved Grant the trouble. How much did she lose? Everything, Grant. Her retirement savings, the life insurance money from when Harold died, even the emergency fund she kept for medical expenses. Phil convinced her to invest in some fake cryptocurrency scheme and pocketed the money. Perfect. Pearl Hamilton was now completely destitute, dependent entirely on Grant's charity to avoid homelessness. The woman who had declared Harry's death a blessing from God was now at the mercy of Harry's father. Grant hung up the phone and walked to his office window, looking out at the city skyline he'd helped build. Each crane on the horizon represented a project he'd managed, a structure he'd engineered to last for generations. Now, he was engineering something different. A perfect system of justice that would ensure everyone who had wronged Harry faced consequences appropriate to their crimes. Phase 3 was nearly complete. Soon, it will be time for the final act. Chapter 7. Controlled Demolition. The Hamilton family gathering was smaller than it had been in years. Pearl sat at the head of her dining room table, the same table where she'd hosted countless family dinners filled with passive-aggressive comments about Grant's worthiness. But now the power dynamic had shifted completely. Jerome remained in county jail, awaiting trial on charges that would likely send him away for 15 to 20 years. Valerie had been released on bond, but was staying with her mother, too ashamed to face the family she'd helped destroy. Craig had been captured in Nevada and was fighting extradition while his assets were frozen by federal investigators. Grant sat at Pearl's right hand, exactly where Harold Hamilton used to sit before his death 5 years earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. As I was explaining, Grant continued, reviewing the papers spread across the table. The foundation issues are more serious than we initially thought. The entire east wall is compromised, and the city engineer is recommending immediate evacuation until repairs can be completed. This was another lie, but Grant had become skilled at weaponizing bureaucracy. A few calls to contacts in the building department, some strategically placed donations to the right retirement funds, and suddenly Pearl's house was facing a list of violations that existed only on paper. "How long will the repairs take?" asked Don Godfrey, who had flown in from Seattle to help Pearl navigate the crisis. 6 to 8 months, minimum. The foundation work alone will take 3 months, and then we'll need to address the electrical, plumbing, and HVAC systems. Pearl, I hate to say this, but you're going to need somewhere else to stay. Pearl's hand shook as she reached for her water glass. I don't have anywhere else to go. Actually, you do. Grant pulled out another set of documents. I've been looking into senior living facilities in the area. Sunset Manor has an opening, and I'm prepared to cover the costs as part of our mortgage agreement. Sunset Manor was the worst-rated nursing home in the county, with a long history of health code violations and patient neglect complaints. It was also the only facility Grant was willing to pay for. Grant, Dawn said carefully, surely there are better options. On Pearl's budget? I'm afraid not. The other facilities require substantial deposits and have waiting lists. Sunset Manor is available immediately. Pearl looked around the table at the faces of family members who had once deferred to her authority. Now, they were all looking to Grant for answers, recognizing that he held all the cards. What about staying with family? Pearl asked desperately. Dawn, couldn't I come to Seattle until... Mom, you know our apartment isn't set up for that. And with the kids' school schedules. Grant watched Pearl realize that none of her children were going to rescue her. The same woman who had raised them to value financial success above all else was learning that money was the only thing that mattered to them in return. Sunset Manor it is, Pearl said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Later that evening, Grant drove to the cemetery where Harry was buried. The small headstone was simple but elegant. Harry Anthony, beloved son, gone too soon. Sarah had chosen the inscription before leaving for Seattle, and Grant visited every day to tell his son about the progress of his mission. Pearl signed the papers today, buddy, Grant said, kneeling by the grave. She'll be in that nursing home by next week, and the house will be mine. I'm thinking about turning it into a youth center, Maybe a place where kids can go after school to be safe. A cool breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree Harry had loved to climb in their backyard. Grant took it as a sign of approval. Jerome's trial starts next month. The prosecutor says he's looking at 25 years, especially since they found evidence linking him to 3 other point-shaving schemes. Valerie's cooperating, so she might get off with just 5 to 10. And Craig's going to spend a long time wishing he'd kept his mouth shut. Grant stood up and brushed dirt from his knees. Tomorrow I deal with Stanley Kinney and those casino friends of Jerome's. The prosecutor wants them on RICO charges, but I want them to know exactly why their lives are falling apart. The next morning, Grant sat in the visitors section of the county courthouse, watching as Stanley Kinney was arraigned on 17 counts of conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. The pit boss who had provided Jerome with insider information looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit. His confidence evaporated now that he faced federal charges. As Stanley was led away in shackles, he caught sight of Grant in the gallery. Their eyes met for a moment, and Grant saw recognition dawn on the man's face. Stanley had finally figured out who had been methodically dismantling his life over the past month. Grant smiled and gave him a small wave. Outside the courthouse, Detective Reynolds approached Grant with a satisfied expression. "Mr. Anthony, I wanted to personally thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. Without your information about Jerome's activities, we never would have uncovered the full scope of this conspiracy. I just wanted justice for my son, Detective." "Well, you're getting it. Jerome Hamilton will never see the outside of a prison cell. Marcus Delacroix and his associates are facing RICO charges that will put them away for life. And we've identified at least 6 other victims who were threatened or intimidated by this organization." Grant nodded gravely. "What about the man who killed Harry? Marcus Vince. His trial is next week. With the evidence we've gathered about the conspiracy, the prosecutor is confident he can prove this was a planned murder, not a drunk driving accident. Vince is looking at life without parole. Justice." The word had lost all meaning during the weeks after Harry's death, when Grant had felt powerless to protect his son even in death. But now, watching Jerome's co-conspirators being led away in handcuffs, the word was beginning to mean something again. But Grant wasn't finished. There was still one more person who needed to understand exactly what it meant to threaten Harry Anthony. As he walked to his car, Grant pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized weeks ago. "Tony Salvatore? This is Grant Anthony. I think it's time we had a conversation about my son." The final act was about to begin. Chapter 8, The Reckoning. Tony, the brick Salvatore agreed to meet at the abandoned Morrison construction site on the outskirts of town, the same location where Grant had once built dreams of the future with his bare hands. Now, it would serve as the setting for a very different kind of construction project. Grant arrived first, as he'd known he would. He'd chosen this location carefully, isolated enough for privacy, but familiar enough that he controlled every advantage. The half-finished office building loomed against the evening sky like a concrete skeleton, its exposed rebar reaching toward the stars like desperate fingers. Tony arrived exactly on time, which surprised Grant. Most criminals were either early out of paranoia or late out of arrogance. But Tony Salvatore moved with the measured confidence of a man who'd survived 20 years in a dangerous profession by being predictable only in his professionalism. "Grant Anthony," Tony said, stepping out of his Lincoln Continental. "I've been hearing a lot about you lately." Grant studied the man who had helped orchestrate his son's death. Tony was shorter than expected, maybe 5'8", but built like a concrete block with hands that looked capable of breaking bones with minimal effort. His expensive suit couldn't hide the predatory stillness that marked him as genuinely dangerous. "And I've been hearing about you, Mr. Salvatore. 37 arrests, 14 convictions, and a reputation for solving problems permanently. Problems like 9-year-old boys who see too much." The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Grant felt his carefully controlled anger flare, but kept his voice level. "My son wasn't a problem. He was a child who witnessed your criminal activity and paid for it with his life." Tony lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his weathered face. "Kid shouldn't have been taking pictures where he didn't belong. Jerome told us the boy was dangerous, that he was going to bring down the whole operation. So you had him killed. I had a drunk driver aimed in the right direction at the right time. Clean, random, no connections to trace back. If Marcus Vince hadn't been such an amateur, your boy's death would have stayed an accident. Grant felt something cold settle in his chest. The casual admission of Harry's murder, delivered with no more emotion than a weather report, crystallized his resolve. You made a mistake, Tony. What's that? You killed the son of an engineer. Do you know what engineers do for a living, Tony? We build things. Complex things. Systems that work together in ways most people can't understand. Tony flicked his cigarette away, finally showing the first sign of wariness. What's your point? My point is that over the past month, I've been building something special. A system designed specifically to destroy you and everyone you work with. Jerome's in prison. Craig's facing federal charges. Stanley's looking at 20 years. Marcus Delacroix's entire organization is under RICO investigation. Grant began walking slowly around the construction site, forcing Tony to turn to follow his movement. But that's just the beginning. You see, I've been studying your operation, Mr. Salvatore, learning about your territories, your income sources, your methods of operation. Studying me? For instance, I know about your arrangement with the docks union, specifically how you've been skimming money from pension funds to finance your gambling operations. I know about the protection racket you run in Little Italy and how you've been underreporting income to both the IRS and your own bosses in the Marconi family. Tony's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket, but Grant continued talking, his voice gaining confidence. I also know about the photographs. This stopped Tony cold. What photographs? Grant pulled out an envelope and scattered its contents on a nearby concrete barrier. Even in the dim light, the images were clear. Tony meeting with FBI agent David Phillips in what appeared to be clandestine circumstances. Interesting thing about surveillance technology these days, Grant said conversationally. High-definition cameras, telephoto lenses, facial recognition software. A man with the right connections can document quite a lot of interesting activities. Tony picked up one of the photographs, his expression growing darker. These are fakes. Are they? Agent Phillips might disagree. You see, I had a very interesting conversation with him last week. Seems he's been developing sources within the Marconi family, and your name came up as someone who might be cooperative in exchange for certain considerations. This was Grant's masterpiece, a lie built on enough truth to be believable. Agent Phillips was real, and he was working organized crime cases. The photographs were real too, but they showed Tony meeting with a different federal agent about an unrelated investigation. Grant had simply engineered the context to suggest betrayal. You're bluffing. Am I? Tony, how do you think I got access to detailed information about Jerome's operation? How do you think I knew exactly which evidence to give Detective Reynolds? Someone inside your organization has been feeding information to law enforcement for months. Grant watched as paranoia began to eat away at Tony's confidence. In organized crime, the suggestion of betrayal was often more dangerous than actual betrayal. The beauty of it, Grant continued, is that even if you kill me right now, the damage is already done. Copies of these photographs are already in the hands of Vincent Marconi, along with detailed financial records showing how much money you've been skimming from family operations. Tony's face had gone pale. Vincent Marconi was notoriously paranoid about traitors within his organization, and suspected informants had a tendency to disappear permanently. What do you want? I want you to understand something, Tony. You killed my son because you thought he was a threat to your operation. But Harry wasn't the threat. I am. Grant began walking back toward his truck, leaving Tony standing among the scattered photographs. You have 48 hours to disappear, Mr. Salvatore. After that, Vincent Marconi is going to receive a very detailed package about your activities, and I suspect his response will be definitive. This isn't over, Anthony. Grant paused at his truck door. Yes, it is. You just don't realize it yet. As he drove away, Grant could see Tony in his rearview mirror, frantically gathering up the photographs that would probably get him killed within the week. The man who had ordered Harry's death was now facing the same terror Harry must have felt in those final moments before the drunk driver's car struck him. But unlike Harry, Tony Salvatore deserved everything that was coming for him. Grant's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Package delivered to VM. Your boy is avenged. A friend. Grant smiled and deleted the message. Sometimes the best engineering was knowing which structures to build and which ones to let collapse under their own weight. Tony Salvatore's world was about to come down around his ears, and Grant Anthony wouldn't lose a moment's sleep over it. Chapter 9. Building Something Beautiful. 6 months later, Grant stood in the transformed space that had once been Pearl Hamilton's house, watching as a group of children worked on homework at tables that had been carefully engineered for their height and needs. The Harry Anthony Youth Center had officially opened 3 weeks earlier, and it was already serving 45 children from the surrounding neighborhood. Sarah had returned from Seattle the previous month, her grief still present, but no longer the crushing weight that had driven her away. Therapy had helped her process not just Harry's death, but the revelation of what Jerome and Valerie had done to their son. She now served as the center's volunteer coordinator, channeling her nursing skills into caring for children who needed safe spaces after school. Mr. Anthony? Tommy Martinez approached hesitantly, a math worksheet in his small hands. Can you help me with this problem? Grant knelt down to Tommy's level, examining the fractions worksheet with the same careful attention he once gave to architectural blueprints. What part is giving you trouble? I don't understand how to add fractions with different denominators. Grant smiled and pulled out a pencil. Let me show you something my son Harry taught me. He said fractions are like building blocks. You just have to make sure they're all the same size before you can stack them together. As they worked through the problem, Grant reflected on the changes that had transformed his life over the past year. Jerome Hamilton had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to conspiracy charges. Valerie had received 8 years and would be eligible for parole in 5. Both had lost their parental rights to their 2 children, who were now living with Valerie's sister in Oregon. Pearl Hamilton had lasted 3 months in Sunset Manor before suffering a stroke that left her requiring full-time care. Grant had quietly arranged for her transfer to a better facility, paying the difference in cost out of his own pocket. Despite everything she'd put him through, he couldn't bring himself to let an elderly woman suffer unnecessarily. Marcus Delacroix and his remaining associates had been convicted on RICO charges and were now serving life sentences in federal prison. Stanley Kinney had cooperated with prosecutors and received a reduced sentence of 12 years. Tony Salvatore had simply vanished. His car had been found in a long-term parking garage at the airport, but there was no record of him boarding any flights. Detective Reynolds suspected he'd been killed by his own associates, but his body had never been recovered. Grant had no idea what had actually happened to Tony, and he didn't want to know. The man who had murdered Harry, Marcus Vince, was serving life without parole in the state penitentiary. Grant had attended every day of his trial, watching as the evidence of conspiracy transformed a drunk driving case into a first-degree murder conviction. I think I understand now, Tommy said, showing Grant his completed worksheet. You have to find the common denominator first. Then everything else makes sense. Exactly right. Sometimes in math, just like in life, you have to change how you're looking at the problem before you can solve it. Tommy beamed with pride and ran off to show his work to Sarah, who was helping another child with a science project. Grant watched his wife smile, genuinely smile, for the first time since Harry's death. That evening, Grant drove to the cemetery for his weekly visit with Harry. The simple headstone now had company. A small garden that Sarah had planted with Harry's favorite flowers, and a bench where parents could sit and remember their own lost children. The center's doing really well, buddy, Grant said, settling onto the bench with the ease of long practice. We've got a waiting list now, and the city council approved funding for a computer lab. Tommy's helping us design it. He says you would have one of the fastest gaming computers we could afford. A gentle breeze stirred the flowers Sarah had planted, carrying the scent of spring growth and new beginnings. Your mom's pregnant again. Grant had been saving this news for weeks, wanting to process it himself before sharing it with Harry. Sarah was 12 weeks along, and the doctors said everything looked healthy and normal. I know what you're thinking. We're too old to be starting over. But sometimes life gives you second chances you didn't know you needed. Your little sister is due in October, and we're going to name her Hope. Grant looked up at the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. I kept my promise, Harry. Everyone who hurt you faced justice. Jerome and Valerie are in prison where they belong. The men who ordered your death are either dead or locked away forever. And Pearl, well, Pearl is learning what it means to depend on the kindness of others. But revenge, Grant had discovered, was a cold comfort compared to the warmth of building something positive from tragedy. The youth center was serving children who needed safe places to learn and grow. Sarah was healing and building new dreams. And somewhere in the future, a little girl named Hope would grow up hearing stories about her big brother who had been gone too long, but was never forgotten. I have to go now, son. Sarah's making dinner, and we have plans to review for the center's expansion. But I'll see you next week, same as always. Grant stood up and brushed dirt from his pants, then paused to read the inscription on Harry's headstone one more time. Beloved son, gone too soon. Not gone, Grant said softly. Just building something beautiful on the other side, waiting for the rest of us to catch up. As he walked back to his truck, Grant felt something he hadn't experienced in over a year: peace. Harry's death had been a tragedy that could never be undone, but from that tragedy, Grant had engineered something meaningful and lasting. Justice for those who deserved punishment, redemption for those who sought it, and hope for those who needed it most. The Harry Anthony Youth Center would serve children for generations to come, ensuring that his son's memory lived on in every life it touched. And that, Grant realized, was the most perfect structure he had ever built. The foundation was love. The framework was justice. And the result was something that would stand the test of time, just like the best buildings always did. Behind him, the wind whispered through the oak trees like a child's laughter, and Grant Anthony smiled as he drove home to his wife and their future. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Trust. James Serrano had built his life on precision and control. At 42, he owned Serrano Construction, a company that had transformed the skyline of 3 counties with its signature steel and glass towers. His calloused hands could read blueprints like scripture, and his steel-gray eyes missed nothing on a job site. Workers respected him not just for his success, but for the quiet intensity that suggested crossing him would be a mistake. 20 years ago, he'd married Laura Leonard, a stunning redhead with emerald eyes who worked as a wedding planner. She'd been the daughter of the town's former police chief, Leonard, a man who died a hero's death in a gang shootout when Laura was just 18. James had fallen for her vulnerability, her need for protection, and her dreams of creating perfect moments for others. Their early years had been golden. James built their dream home on 10 acres outside town, a modern fortress with panoramic windows, a workshop larger than most houses, and a wine cellar that doubled as a safe room. Laura's business, Forever Moments, became the premier wedding planning service in the region. They seemed untouchable, but success breeds complacency, and complacency breeds blindness. The first crack appeared 6 months ago when James noticed Laura working later hours, taking calls in private, and being unusually protective of her phone. When he'd asked about it, she'd smiled that same radiant smile that had captured his heart and explained she was planning a celebrity wedding that required absolute discretion. "Trust me, honey," she'd said, running her fingers through his dark hair. "This contract will set us up for life." James had trusted her. Trust was the foundation of everything he'd built. The second crack came when he discovered she'd taken out a second mortgage on their home without telling him. When confronted, Laura had tears in her eyes as she explained that the celebrity client had required a substantial upfront investment for exclusive vendors. She'd handled it quietly to surprise him with the success. "I wanted to prove I could build something as impressive as your construction empire," she'd whispered against his chest. Again, James had trusted her. But this time, he'd begun watching. What he saw over the next weeks chilled him. Late-night texts that made her smile in ways she hadn't smiled at him in years. Phone calls where she'd lower her voice and step onto the balcony. Credit card statements showing expensive dinners at restaurants they'd never visited together. The third crack became a chasm when he hired a private investigator, Marvin Grimes, a former cop who specialized in matrimonial cases. The photos Marvin delivered were clinical and devastating. Laura entering a downtown hotel with Salvador Patton, a smooth-talking real estate developer who'd been circling James's more successful projects like a vulture for years. Salvador was everything James wasn't. Flashy where James was solid, charming where James was direct, and apparently irresistible where James had become predictable. The photos showed intimate dinners, weekend getaways, and worst of all, passionate embraces in hotel rooms that James's hard work had unknowingly funded. But James hadn't acted immediately. He was a planner, a builder who understood that lasting structures required solid foundations. If he was going to tear down his marriage, he needed to understand every support beam and weak point first. He'd spent weeks documenting everything. Bank records, phone logs, hotel receipts, and even recordings from listening devices he'd planted in Laura's car and office. The evidence painted a picture of a woman who'd been living a double life for over 8 months, funding her affair with their joint assets while planning to leave him for a man who promised her a lifestyle James's steady success couldn't match. The irony wasn't lost on him. Laura had been planning the destruction of their marriage with the same meticulous attention to detail she brought to her clients' wedding celebrations. The betrayal was as carefully orchestrated as any project James had ever managed. That's when he'd made his decision. If Laura wanted to destroy their marriage, he'd give her exactly what she wanted, but on his terms and with consequences she'd never imagined. James Serrano had built his reputation on delivering projects ahead of schedule and under budget. This project will be no different. Chapter 2. The Perfect Storm. The revelation of Laura's betrayal had transformed James from a trusting husband into something far more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose and every resource at his disposal to exact justice. But before he could implement his plan, fate handed him an opportunity he couldn't have scripted better himself. It began with a phone call on a rain-soaked Thursday evening. Laura had been working late, again, which James now knew meant she was at Salvador's penthouse apartment. The caller was Ethel Blackburn, Laura's mother, a bitter woman who'd never forgiven the world for taking her husband and had spent the last 24 years making everyone around her pay for her grief. "James, darling." Ethel's voice dripped with false sweetness through the phone. "I need to speak with you about something important. Can you come by tonight?" Ethel lived in the old Leonard family home, a Victorian monster on the wrong side of town that she'd let decay around her like her own spirit. When James arrived, he found her in the parlor, surrounded by her collection of porcelain dolls and newspaper clippings about her dead husband's heroics. "Sit down, James," she commanded, pouring herself another glass of gin. "We need to discuss Laura's future." "What about her future?" Ethel's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Oh, don't play dumb with me. You think I don't know about Salvador? About their plans?" James kept his expression neutral, but internally his mind raced. "What plans?" "The wedding, you fool. They're planning to get married next month. A destination wedding in the Bahamas. Very romantic, very expensive." Ethel's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "Laura's been using your money to fund the entire affair, including Salvador's gambling debts." This was new information. James had known about the affair, but not about immediate marriage plans or Salvador's financial problems. "How do you know this?" "Because she asked me to sell my house to help fund their new life together." Can you imagine? Asking me to give up the last piece of her father's memory so she can run off with some smooth-talking con man. Ethel leaned forward, her gin-soaked breath washing over James. "But here's what she doesn't know. I've done my own research on Mr. Salvador Patton." Ethel produced a manila folder thick with documents. "Your wife's boyfriend isn't just a real estate developer, James. He's a professional con man who specializes in targeting successful men's wives. You're not his first victim, and you won't be his last unless someone stops him." James flipped through the documents. Police reports from 3 other states, bankruptcy filings, and testimonials from other men who'd lost their wives and fortunes to Salvador's schemes. The pattern was always the same. Charm the wife, drain the joint assets, disappear after a quickie wedding, leaving both the original husband and the victimized wife broke and heartbroken. "Why are you telling me this?" James asked. Ethel's smile was pure venom. "Because Laura is about to destroy herself, and I want front row seats. But more importantly, I want Salvador Patton to pay for thinking he could use a Leonard woman as a disposable pawn in his games." That night, James sat in his workshop, surrounded by the tools of his trade, and formulated a plan that would make Salvador's previous cons look like child's play. If Salvador wanted to play games with other people's lives, James would teach him the rules of a much deadlier game. The first phase involved using Salvador's own greed against him. James began leaking information through construction industry contacts about a massive development project, a $50 million resort complex that required a specific type of real estate expertise. The bait was irresistible: quick profits, minimal oversight, and the kind of prestige project that would establish Salvador as a major player in the region. James made sure Salvador learned that Serrano Construction was the prime contractor and that the developer was actively seeking a real estate partner with Salvador's specific qualifications. The hook was set when James arranged for Salvador to accidentally encounter him at the country club bar. "Serrano," Salvador's voice boomed across the mahogany-paneled room. "Just the man I wanted to see. I hear you're working on something big." James looked up from his whiskey, his expression carefully neutral. "Salvador, I heard you and Laura were getting serious. Congratulations." Salvador's smile faltered for just a moment. Clearly, he hadn't expected James to know about their relationship. "Well, yes, we've been seeing each other. Laura's an amazing woman." "She is," James agreed. "Which is why I hope you'll treat her better than you treated Margaret Walsh in Denver or Susan Rodriguez in Phoenix." The color drained from Salvador's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." James stood, placing a 20 on the bar. "Of course you don't. Just like you don't know anything about the oceanfront development project. Good luck with that, Salvador. I'm sure it'll work out exactly like your other ventures." As James walked away, he could feel Salvador's eyes burning into his back. The seeds of paranoia were planted. Now Salvador would spend sleepless nights wondering what James knew and what he was planning to do with that knowledge. But the real beauty of James's plan wasn't in what Salvador thought he knew. It was in what Salvador would do when his desperation peaked. Chapter 3: The Hammer Falls. 2 weeks later, Salvador's desperation had reached its crescendo. James's carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare had worked perfectly. Through intermediaries and anonymous tips, he'd ensured that Salvador's creditors knew about his location. His gambling debts were called in early, and his few legitimate business deals began falling through due to routine background checks that revealed his previous schemes. Salvador was drowning, and Laura was his only lifeline to the money he needed to escape the closing net. But their planned wedding in the Bahamas required immediate access to substantial cash that was tied up in James's assets and couldn't be accessed without his cooperation or death. The plan Salvador and Laura hatched was desperate and sloppy, born from panic rather than careful consideration. They would stage a home invasion gone wrong, with Salvador playing the role of the hero who tried to save James but arrived too late. Laura would inherit everything. They'd liquidate the assets quickly and disappear to a non-extradition country before anyone could investigate too closely. What they didn't know was that James had anticipated this exact scenario. His home security system didn't just record video. It transmitted everything in real time to multiple secure servers. More importantly, he'd spent the last week preparing for their inevitable move. The attack came on a Saturday morning when Laura knew James would be alone in his workshop. She'd sent the housekeeping staff away early and made sure his usual Saturday golf game was canceled due to family obligations. Salvador entered through the side door that Laura had left unlocked, carrying a carpenter's hammer from James's own tool collection. James was ready. When Salvador crept into the workshop, he found James apparently absorbed in reviewing blueprints at his drafting table. Salvador raised the hammer, aiming for the killing blow that would solve all his problems. James moved at the last second. The hammer crashed into the drafting table instead of his skull, but Salvador's follow-up swing caught James across the temple, sending him sprawling to the concrete floor. Blood poured from the gash, and James's vision blurred as Salvador raised the hammer for another strike. "You should have just signed the papers when she asked," Salvador panted, his face twisted with desperate rage. "Should have made this easy." James rolled away from the next swing, his hand closing around a box cutter he'd strategically placed near the workbench. As Salvador brought the hammer down again, James swept the blade across his attacker's Achilles tendon. Salvador's scream echoed through the workshop as he collapsed, the hammer clattering across the floor. James struggled to his feet, blood streaming down his face, and looked down at the man who tried to kill him for money and a woman who'd already betrayed them both. "My wife's new boyfriend just shattered my skull with a hammer," James said into his phone, his voice deadly calm despite the blood loss. "I was half conscious, tried to call the ambulance." But before he could complete the call, Laura burst into the workshop. Her face was a mask of panic as she saw Salvador writhing on the floor and James standing over him with the phone. She snatched the phone from his bloodied hands. "It's just a scratch. You'll ruin our wedding plans." James stared at his wife, the woman he'd loved for 20 years, the woman he'd built a life with, the woman who'd just revealed that her primary concern wasn't his injury or even her lover's condition, but protecting their escape plan. At that moment, Ethel appeared in the doorway, drawn by Salvador's screams. She took in the scene with cold satisfaction before looking at her injured son-in-law. "Stop being such a crybaby weakling, James," she sneered. "Men have survived worse than a little bump on the head." James felt something inside him break. Not his skull, which throbbed with pain, but something deeper and more fundamental. The last vestige of the man who believed in trust and family and the bonds that held civilization together. They had no idea what he would do next. James looked at Salvador, still bleeding on his workshop floor. He looked at Laura, clutching the phone like it was her ticket to freedom. He looked at Ethel, whose bitter smile suggested she was enjoying the chaos she'd helped create. And then James smiled back, a cold, terrible expression that would haunt their nightmares for however long they had left to dream. "You're right," he said quietly, taking the phone back from Laura's suddenly nerveless fingers. "It is just a scratch." He ended the emergency call and turned off the phone completely. But attempted murder isn't. Chapter 4. The Architect of Ruin. 3 hours later, James sat in the emergency room as a doctor stitched the gash in his scalp. The official story was that he'd been injured in a workshop accident, a story that Salvador and Laura were only too eager to support once they understood the alternative James was offering. "Here's how this is going to work," James had explained to them as Salvador's bleeding slowly stopped with makeshift bandages. "You have two choices. Option 1. I call the police, show them the security footage of Salvador breaking in and attacking me with a hammer, and you both spend the next 20 years in prison. Option 2. You play along with my workshop accident story, and I let you live long enough to regret ever meeting each other." The choice had been easy for them. What they didn't understand was that James's mercy was not kindness. It was a much more elaborate form of justice. While the doctor worked on his stitches, James used his tablet to monitor the first phase of his real plan. His construction company employed some of the most skilled tradesmen in the state, men who owed their livelihoods to James's success and their loyalty to his fair treatment over the years. More importantly, several of them had backgrounds that made them uniquely qualified for specialized projects. Mickey Boyd had been a demolitions expert in the Army before joining Serrano Construction. Dean Anderson was a master electrician who'd worked black operations for a government contractor that didn't officially exist. Ronnie Keller had been a locksmith before discovering his talent for carpentry, and his old skills remained sharp. By the time James returned home that evening, his team had already begun their work. The security cameras had been upgraded with additional features that would record everything but only transmit what James wanted the outside world to see. The house's electrical system had been modified in ways that would be invisible to casual inspection but would give James complete control over every light, lock, and appliance. Most importantly, the foundation of his home had been subtly altered. What appeared to be minor earthquake retrofitting was actually the installation of a sophisticated containment system. James's wine cellar, already designed as a safe room, had been expanded into something far more versatile. "How's the head?" Laura asked when he entered their bedroom. She was packing a suitcase with shaking hands, her earlier bravado replaced by a fear she couldn't quite understand. "It'll heal," James replied, watching her fold clothes with the desperate efficiency of someone planning to run. "Where are you going?" I thought maybe I should stay with my mother for a few days. While you recover." James nodded thoughtfully. "That's probably best. Give us both some time to think about our future." Laura's relief was palpable. She kissed his cheek, a gesture that felt like betrayal masquerading as affection, and hurried downstairs with her luggage. James watched from the window as she loaded her car and drove away, probably to comfort Salvador and plan their next move. They still thought they were playing the same game they'd always played: manipulation, seduction, and financial exploitation. They had no idea that James had changed the rules entirely. That night, James sat in his workshop, no longer surrounded by the tools of construction, but by the instruments of a much more precise craft. On his computer screen were detailed floor plans, not of buildings he intended to create, but of spaces he intended to control absolutely. The basement of the old Leonard house where Ethel lived was about to undergo some renovations. The penthouse apartment where Salvador had been staying was due for some electrical work. And the storage facility where Laura kept her business inventory needed some structural improvements. Each location would become a stage in an elaborate performance that would teach his betrayers the true meaning of powerlessness. They'd taken his trust, his money, and his safety. Now he would take their freedom, their hope, and finally, their lives, but not before they understood exactly what they'd lost and what they'd never had. James pulled up the security footage from that morning, watching Salvador creep through his home with murder in his eyes. He studied Laura's face as she snatched the phone, prioritizing their escape over his life. He replayed Ethel's sneer as she called him a weakling. By dawn, he had their fates planned down to the minute. The game was no longer about money or marriage or even justice. It was about showing three people who'd underestimated him exactly what a master builder could construct when he set his mind to creating hell on earth. Chapter 5. The Trap Springs. Salvador Patton discovered the first sign that his world was collapsing when he tried to access his offshore accounts the next morning. Every password had been changed, every security question had been altered, and every attempt to contact customer service resulted in automated messages claiming his accounts were under investigation for suspicious activity. The second sign came when he arrived at his penthouse to find the building's management waiting for him with an eviction notice. Apparently, his lease had been purchased by an unnamed corporation, and his residency was being terminated due to violations of the building's moral conduct clauses. The third sign was when Laura called him, sobbing hysterically. "Salvador, something's wrong. My mother won't answer her phone, and when I went to her house, all the locks have been changed. There's a notice on the door saying the property is under renovation by court order." Salvador's hands trembled as he held the phone. "Court order? What court order?" "I don't know. The notice says all inquiries should be directed to Serrano Construction, but that can't be right." James wouldn't. He couldn't. Laura's voice trailed off as the implications hit her. But James could, and he had. Using his connections in the construction industry and the local government, James had maneuvered all the pieces into position. Ethel's house had been declared a health hazard due to structural problems that had been mysteriously discovered during a routine inspection. Salvador's building had been sold to a shell company that James controlled through a network of business partnerships. And Laura's storage facility had been condemned due to electrical violations that hadn't existed the day before. The beautiful simplicity of it was that everything was completely legal. James hadn't broken any laws. He'd simply used his knowledge of building codes, zoning regulations, and municipal procedures to systematically dismantle their lives within the framework of legitimate bureaucracy. By noon, Salvador and Laura were homeless, penniless, and completely dependent on James's mercy for even the most basic necessities. Their bank accounts have been frozen, pending investigation into suspicious money transfers. Their credit cards have been canceled due to non-payment of debts that had suddenly appeared on their records. Even their cell phones have been disconnected for failure to pay bills that had been mysteriously redirected to addresses that didn't exist. James turned to look at her, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of the man she'd married. The man who'd loved her, protected her, built a life around her happiness. Then the flicker died, replaced by something cold and implacable. Laura, 24 hours ago, you watched a man try to murder me with a hammer, and your primary concern was protecting your wedding plans. 8 hours ago, you were in a hotel room with that same man, planning how to liquidate my assets after my funeral. 2 hours ago, you called me crying for help with problems you created through your own betrayal. He walked back to his desk and pressed another button. The monitors shifted to show recorded conversations. Laura and Salvador planning the attack, discussing which assets would be easiest to convert to cash, even joking about how long they'd have to wait before it would be appropriate for the grieving widow to remarry. This is who you are, James continued. This is who you've always been. I just finally have clear vision. The trailer fell silent except for the hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of construction machinery working through the night shift. Somewhere in that darkness, James's crew was building something that would serve purposes Salvador and Laura couldn't yet imagine. Your education begins tomorrow, James announced. Salvador, you'll report to the construction site at 6 a.m. Laura, you'll be relocating to specialized accommodations where you can reflect on the choices that brought you here. What if we refuse? Salvador asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. James gestured toward the monitor showing the men outside. Then your education will be much shorter and considerably more painful. As if on cue, the locks disengaged and the trailer door opened. The three men in suits stepped inside, their expressions professionally neutral, but their intent unmistakable. These gentlemen will escort you to your new accommodations, James said. I suggest you use the time to consider how much you value the privileges you've taken for granted, things like privacy, comfort, dignity, and hope. As Salvador and Laura were led away into the night, James returned his attention to the blueprints on his wall. Phase 1 of their education was complete. They now understood that their old lives were gone forever and that their survival depended entirely on his mercy. Phase 2 would teach them that mercy was not something he was inclined to provide. Chapter 7. The Classroom of Consequence. Salvador's first day as a laborer began at 4:30 a.m. in a windowless room that had once been a storage closet, but now served as his living quarters. The space was exactly 6 feet by 8 feet, large enough to contain a narrow cot, a bucket that served multiple purposes, and nothing else. The walls were concrete, the door was steel, and the single light bulb was controlled by someone else. When the door opened at 6 a.m. sharp, Salvador was escorted by Mickey Boyd, James's demolitions expert who traded his military fatigue for work clothes but retained the bearing of a man comfortable with violence. Morning, sunshine, Mickey said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Time to earn your keep. The construction site where Salvador would spend his days was a masterpiece of psychological architecture. James had designed it to be simultaneously a legitimate renovation project and an elaborate torture device that left no marks but broke spirits with mechanical precision. Salvador's first task was simple. Move a pile of concrete blocks from one side of the site to the other, stack them precisely according to a diagram, then move them back when the specifications changed. The blocks weighed 50 pounds each, and there were 200 of them. The work had to be completed by lunch, or there would be no lunch. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, Laura was beginning her own education in a space that had once been the basement of her mother's house. James's renovation had transformed it into something that resembled a luxury hotel room. If luxury hotels were designed by people who understood that comfort could be a weapon more effective than pain. The room was beautiful. Hardwood floors, expensive furniture, ambient lighting, and a view through one-way glass that showed her the garden where she'd played as a child. Everything she needed was provided. Gourmet meals delivered through a slot, designer clothes in her exact size, even books and magazines for entertainment. The psychological torture was in the perfection itself. She was living in luxury while knowing that every comfort was a gift from the man she'd betrayed, provided at his whim and revocable at his pleasure. The one-way glass meant she could see out, but knew she was being watched constantly. The beautiful room was still a cage, and the golden bars were somehow more degrading than iron ones would have been. On the third day, James visited her. He entered through a door she hadn't even known existed, blending seamlessly with the wall's wood paneling. He looked impeccable in a tailored suit, every inch the successful businessman she'd married, while she sat in silk pajamas that felt like a costume in her own prison. "How are you adjusting to your new accommodations?" he asked politely, as if inquiring about a hotel stay. Laura had spent 72 hours alternating between rage, despair, and bargaining with a god she wasn't sure was listening. Now, faced with James's clinical politeness, she felt something break inside her chest. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. James sat down across from her in a chair that hadn't been there moments before, another reminder that he controlled every aspect of her environment. "I want you to understand what you did," he said simply. "Not just the affair, not just the theft, but the fundamental violation of trust that made those things possible." He placed a tablet on the coffee table between them. The screen showed security footage from their home over the past 8 months. Her secret phone calls, her lies about working late, her stealing documents from his office to learn about his assets. "You see, Laura, I could forgive the affair. People fall out of love, marriages end, hearts change. I could even forgive the money. It's just paper, and I can always make more." The footage shifted to show her helping Salvador case their home, pointing out the location of safes, discussing James's routines, even suggesting the best time and method for the attack. "But this," James continued, his voice never rising above conversational level, "this is unforgivable. You didn't just stop loving me, Laura. You started planning my death." Laura tried to speak, but James held up a hand. "I'm not interested in excuses or explanations. I'm interested in education. Do you know what happened to your mother?" The question hit Laura like a physical blow. "Where is she? Is she alive?" "She's safe," James replied. "She's living in a very comfortable facility that specializes in caring for people who've had psychological breaks. The shock of learning about your plans for my murder was quite traumatic for her, particularly when she realized that your inheritance would have included selling her childhood home to fund your escape." Laura stared at him in horror. "You told her?" They met at a diner on the outskirts of town, two people who'd thought they were predators discovering they'd been prey all along. "This is impossible," Salvador muttered, stirring sugar into coffee he couldn't afford. "No one person could coordinate all of this." Laura stared out the window at the construction crew working on a new shopping center across the street. The Serrano Construction logo was prominently displayed on every vehicle and piece of equipment. "You don't know my husband," she whispered. "When James builds something, it stays built. When he tears something down." She didn't finish the sentence. Their phones rang simultaneously, cheap prepaid devices that had been delivered to the diner with a note instructing them to answer immediately. James's voice was calm and conversational, as if he were discussing weekend plans rather than the systematic destruction of their lives. "I hope you're enjoying your lunch. The coffee at Martha's Diner isn't great, but it's all you can afford now. I wanted to give you an update on your current situation." Salvador gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles went white. "You son of a bitch, what have you done?" "I've given you exactly what you wanted, Salvador. Freedom from your previous obligations. Of course, freedom comes with certain costs, as you're discovering." "James," Laura interrupted, her voice breaking. "Please, we can work this out. We can fix this." James's laughter was soft and terrible. "Fix what, Laura? Your affair? Your theft? Your attempt to have me murdered? Which part exactly do you think can be fixed?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "Here's what's going to happen," James continued. "In 1 hour, you'll receive instructions on where to go. You'll follow those instructions exactly, or your current problems will seem like minor inconveniences compared to what comes next. Don't try to run. I own this town's infrastructure now, and there's nowhere you can hide that I won't find you." The line went dead. Salvador and Laura sat in stunned silence, the magnitude of their situation finally becoming clear. They'd thought they were executing a simple con, but they'd stumbled into a trap so elaborate and comprehensive that escape was impossible. 1 hour later, the instructions arrived, an address on the industrial side of town with a single line of additional text. Come alone, but come together. The education you've been lacking is about to begin. As they drove through the darkening streets toward an uncertain fate, neither Salvador nor Laura spoke. There was nothing left to say. They betrayed a man who built his life on precision and control, and now they were about to learn what happens when that precision and control are turned toward destruction. The address led them to a construction site surrounded by high fences and security cameras. The gate stood open, and floodlights illuminated a path leading to a trailer that served as the site office. They had no choice but to follow the path James had built for them, leading to a reckoning that would make their worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. Chapter 6. The Foundation of Fear. The construction trailer that Salvador and Laura entered was not what they expected. Instead of the typical chaos of a worksite office, they found themselves in a meticulously organized space that resembled a command center more than a temporary building. Multiple monitors displayed camera feeds from locations they recognized. Ethel's house, Salvador's former penthouse, Laura's business office, along with feeds from places they didn't recognize but suspected they would soon become familiar with. James sat behind a desk made from a massive slab of steel and concrete, a physical representation of the industry that had built his fortune and was now funding their destruction. His head wound was hidden beneath a dark bandage, but his gray eyes were clear and focused with an intensity that made both visitors instinctively step backward. Sit, he commanded, gesturing to two metal folding chairs positioned precisely 6 feet from his desk. When they hesitated, the lights in the trailer dimmed and the door locks engaged with an audible click. The message was clear. They would sit voluntarily, or they would be made to understand that their voluntary cooperation was the only illusion of control they had left. Let me explain your situation, James began, his voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone he used when discussing construction schedules. Salvador, your gambling debts now total approximately $200,000, thanks to some recent investments I've made in your creditors' patience. The people you owe money to are no longer the civilized casino managers you're used to dealing with. They're considerably more direct in their collection methods. Salvador's face paled. You can't just. I can, and I have. James touched a button on his desk, and one of the monitors displayed a feed from outside the trailer. 3 large men in expensive suits stood next to a black sedan, clearly visible in the floodlights. They're waiting for my instructions. I can tell them you're not ready to discuss payment, or I can tell them you're ready to work off your debt in ways that don't require money. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had already consumed everything around it. James turned his attention to Laura. As for you, my dear wife, your situation is somewhat more complex. You see, when you forged my signature on those loan documents, you technically committed bank fraud. When you used our joint accounts to fund your affair, you committed theft. When you helped plan my murder, you became an accessory to attempted homicide. Laura's voice was barely a whisper. What do you want from us? James smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than any show of anger would have been. I want you to understand what you've lost. Both of you have spent your lives taking things that didn't belong to you: money, trust, love, lives. You've never experienced being on the receiving end of that equation. He stood and walked to a wall-mounted blueprint that showed detailed construction plans. This is a restoration project I'm working on. It involves converting an old industrial building into a specialized training facility. The work requires very specific skills and absolute attention to detail. Salvador found his voice. What kind of training facility? The kind that teaches people the value of the things they've taken for granted. James traced a finger along the blueprint, following lines that showed a complex network of rooms, corridors, and what appear to be observation areas. You'll both be participating in this project, Salvador as a laborer, Laura as a subject study. The clinical detachment in his voice was more frightening than any emotional outburst could have been. "James, please," Laura tried again. "I know I made mistakes, but we can fix this. We can go back to the way things were." Laura looked up from the book she'd been pretending to read. A romance novel about true love conquering all obstacles, which James had selected with deliberate irony. The good news is that her psychological condition has stabilized. The bad news is that the stabilization involves a complete rejection of the daughter who betrayed everything she believed about family and love. He opened the folder and removed a single sheet of paper, a legal document written in formal language but clear in its intent. "She's legally disowned you, Laura. Changed her will, revoked your power of attorney, and formally requested that you never contact her again. She's also provided testimony to the district attorney regarding your confession to her about planning my murder." Laura's hands shook as she read the document. Her mother's signature at the bottom was firm and clear, with none of the trembling uncertainty of age. This was a decision made with complete conviction. "She wanted me to give you a message," James continued. "She said to tell you that she raised a daughter to honor the Leonard family name. But that daughter died the day you chose money over marriage vows." The paper fell from Laura's nerveless fingers. "Of course," James added, his tone becoming almost conversational, "none of this has to be permanent. Family relationships can be rebuilt, trust can be restored, and people can find their way back to each other." Laura looked up with desperate hope. "The process just requires complete honesty about past mistakes and genuine commitment to making amends." James's smile was gentle and terrible. "Are you ready to begin that process, Laura?" She nodded frantically, willing to agree to anything that might offer a path back to the life she destroyed. "Excellent. We'll start tomorrow." As James left her alone with the ruins of her family relationships, Laura finally understood that her education was entering its final phase, the one where she would learn that some betrayals are too complete for forgiveness, and some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Chapter 9. The Final Blueprint. 6 months later, James sat in his office overlooking the completed Riverside Rehabilitation Center, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The facility was now operational, funded through a combination of government grants, private donations, and the liquidated assets of people who'd learned too late that actions have consequences. Salvador had become patient zero in the center's betrayal trauma treatment program. After 4 months of viewing testimonies from his victims, writing response letters, and participating in group therapy with other perpetrators, something fundamental had broken inside him. He now spent his days in productive catatonia, weaving baskets with mechanical precision while muttering apologies to people who weren't in the room. The psychiatrist called it a breakthrough. James called it justice. Salvador's gambling debts had been paid off through an innovative work release program that involved construction projects in countries that didn't ask many questions about worker safety or overtime regulations. He would never again have the opportunity to seduce vulnerable women or destroy trusting marriages, but he would live, in a manner of speaking, for many years to come. Laura's rehabilitation had taken a different path entirely. James entered her beautiful prison that morning to find her exactly where he'd left her the day before, sitting in the chair by the window, staring at the garden beyond the one-way glass with the hollow expression of someone who'd finally understood the magnitude of what they'd lost. "Good morning," James said, settling into his usual chair with the folder that contained her daily lesson. She didn't respond. She rarely spoke anymore. Not since the day 3 months ago when James had played her the recording of her mother's final message. The one where Ethel explained in precise, devastating detail why her daughter was dead to her and always would be. Today's lesson concerns the concept of redemption. James began, opening the folder to reveal photographs and documents. The question we're exploring is whether someone who's betrayed a sacred trust can ever truly make amends. The photographs showed scenes from the life Laura had destroyed, their wedding day, vacations they'd taken together, quiet moments of happiness captured when she'd still been capable of genuine emotion. Mixed among them were more recent images, James alone at charitable functions where they'd once appeared together, the empty space beside him in church where she used to sit, the dinner table set for one. I've been giving this question considerable thought, James continued, and I've reached some interesting conclusions. He placed a new document on the table between them, a death certificate bearing Laura's name and yesterday's date. According to the state records, Laura Leonard Serrano died in a single-car accident on Highway 15. The police report indicates she was driving erratically, possibly under the influence of grief over her husband's recent murder by her boyfriend. Very tragic, very final. Laura's eyes focused for the first time in weeks, staring at the certificate with growing horror. The woman sitting in this chair is now Alice Walton, a patient at our facility who suffered from severe dissociative identity disorder brought on by witnessing her husband's murder. She has no memory of her previous life, no family to claim her, and no legal identity beyond her patient records. James's voice remained calm and clinical as he explained the architecture of her new existence. Alice will live here for the rest of her natural life, receiving excellent care and treatment for her condition. She'll be comfortable, safe, and well-fed. She'll also be completely isolated from the outside world, with no visitors, no phone calls, and no mail except what the medical staff deems therapeutically appropriate. The beautiful room suddenly felt smaller, its luxury transformed into the appointments of a tomb. I showed her the recordings, the documents, the bank records. Your mother spent 24 years mourning a hero and dreaming of the day her daughter would find the kind of man worthy of the Leonard name. James's smile was sharp as winter sunlight. Learning that her daughter had become an accessory to murder was educational for her as well. The cruelty of it took Laura's breath away. James hadn't just imprisoned her. He destroyed her mother's faith in her, probably permanently. "You're a monster," she breathed. James considered this seriously. "Perhaps, but I'm a monster you created, Laura. Every lie you told, every dollar you stole, every moment you spent planning my death. You are building the man sitting across from you now." He stood to leave, then paused at the hidden door. "Salvador is learning about the value of honest work. Your mother is learning about the consequences of raising a child without moral boundaries. And you're learning about the luxury of safety and comfort, luxuries you were willing to take away from me permanently." The door sealed behind him, leaving Laura alone with the tablet and the footage of her own betrayal playing on an endless loop. Outside, James walked through the night air toward the construction site, where Salvador was discovering that 12-hour days of backbreaking labor were easier to endure than 12-hour nights of sleepless anticipation for the next day's suffering. The education of his betrayers was proceeding exactly according to plan. Chapter 8. The Weight of Revelation. 2 weeks into their re-education, Salvador had lost 15 pounds and developed calluses that would never fully heal, while Laura had gained a thorough understanding of how quickly luxury could become torture when seasoned with helplessness. But James's true lesson was just beginning. On a Tuesday morning that started like all the others, Salvador was midway through his daily task, digging foundation trenches with hand tools because the mechanical equipment was mysteriously always broken, when Mickey Boyd approached with an unusually grim expression. "Boss wants to see you," Mickey said. "Clean up first. You're going somewhere that requires better hygiene than this place." An hour later, Salvador sat in the back of a van with tinted windows, his wrists secured with zip ties and his ankles chained to the floor. The ride took 45 minutes, leading through parts of the state he'd never seen before, until they arrived at what appeared to be a private medical facility nestled in rolling hills far from any main roads. James was waiting in the lobby, dressed in a doctor's white coat that fit him perfectly and carried an ID badge identifying him as Dr. Serrano, Chief of Psychiatric Research. "Welcome to the Riverside Rehabilitation Center," James said pleasantly. "This facility specializes in treating patients who've suffered severe psychological trauma, often as a result of betrayal by trusted loved ones." Salvador was led through corridors lined with rooms where patients sat in various states of catatonic withdrawal. Some stared at walls, others rocked back and forth, and a few mumbled to themselves about trust and promises and the way people they'd loved had destroyed their lives. Each of these patients was recommended to our care by family members who felt traditional therapy wasn't sufficient for their conditions. James explained as they walked. We specialize in helping people understand the long-term consequences of betrayal trauma. They stopped outside a room with a large observation window. Inside, a middle-aged woman sat motionless in a chair, staring at a wedding photo held in hands that trembled constantly. Margaret Walsh, James said. She was one of your earlier victims, Salvador. Her husband brought her here after she suffered a complete psychological breakdown following your disappearance with their life savings. Salvador's blood turned to ice water. The next room contained a younger man who'd arranged toy soldiers in precise formations on a table, only to knock them down and start over again in an endless cycle. Robert Chun. His wife followed your playbook exactly. The affair, the financial theft, the staged disappearance. He was found 3 days later in his garage with the car running and a note apologizing for not being man enough to keep his wife happy. James's voice remained clinical and detached as they moved to the next room. We saved him, of course, but as you can see, the recovery process is ongoing. Room after room revealed the hidden casualties of Salvador's career. Broken spouses, traumatized children, elderly parents who'd lost their homes and their faith in their children's love. The facility housed dozens of people whose lives had been collateral damage and Salvador had never looked back to examine. The beauty of your operation, James continued, was that you always moved on before seeing the real consequences. You got to enjoy the money and the excitement of the seduction without witnessing the suicides, the breakdowns, or the families torn apart by the revelation that love could be purchased and discarded like any other commodity. They entered a conference room where Salvador was seated at a table across from a panel of 3 individuals, a psychiatrist, a social worker, and someone identified only as a patient advocate. Mr. Patton, the psychiatrist began, "We've brought you here to participate in a new treatment protocol we're developing. It's based on the theory that perpetrators of betrayal trauma can be rehabilitated through direct exposure to the consequences of their actions." A projector screen descended from the ceiling, and Salvador found himself watching video testimony from his victims, people he barely remembered, but who remembered him with crystalline clarity. They spoke about the dreams that had been destroyed, the trust that had been shattered, and the way his betrayal had poisoned every relationship they'd attempted since. The treatment requires you to observe these testimonies for 8 hours a day, the social worker explained. You'll then be asked to write detailed responses to each victim, explaining your understanding of how your actions affected their lives. "And if I refuse?" Salvador asked, though his voice had lost all its former confidence. The patient advocate smiled with the kind of professional warmth that radiated from predators disguised as caregivers. "Oh, participation is entirely voluntary. Of course, your debt to our funding partners requires some form of payment, and manual labor was the only alternative arrangement we could negotiate." Salvador looked through the conference room window at the construction site visible in the distance, where prisoners in orange jumpsuits were breaking rocks under the supervision of guards with automatic weapons. "I understand," he whispered. While Salvador was discovering the true cost of his career choices, Laura was receiving a visitor of her own. James entered her beautiful prison, carrying a manila folder and wearing an expression that somehow managed to be both sympathetic and merciless. "I have news about your mother," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Is this redemption?" James asked philosophically. "Alice gets to live, which is more mercy than she showed me when she helped plan my murder. She gets comfort and safety, which is more than her victims usually receive. And she gets time, years and years of time, to reflect on the choices that led her here." He stood to leave, then paused at the hidden door. "Of course, if Alice ever recovers her memory enough to remember who she used to be, the staff will interpret that as a psychological crisis requiring immediate intervention. We've found that electroconvulsive therapy is very effective at helping patients let go of traumatic memories." The door sealed behind him with the soft finality of a coffin lid closing. James walked through the facility's corridors, past rooms filled with people learning that betrayal was a luxury they could no longer afford. Some were genuine patients who'd been damaged by the Salvador Pattons of the world. Others were former predators undergoing the kind of rehabilitation that ensured they'd never hurt anyone again. The beauty of the system was its perfect justice. Everyone received exactly what they'd given others. Betrayers learned about trust, thieves learned about loss, and people who destroyed families discovered what it felt like to have their own identities dissolved completely. In his office, James reviewed the final reports from his legal team. The estate of James Serrano had been settled efficiently, with the surviving husband receiving everything according to the will they'd filed probate court. There had been no challenges to the inheritance, no suspicious inquiries, and no loose ends requiring attention. As far as the world knew, James was a widower who'd lost his wife in a tragic accident shortly after surviving a murder attempt by her lover. He'd channeled his grief into philanthropic work, funding mental health facilities for trauma victims and supporting legislation aimed at protecting families from financial predators. He was, by all accounts, a pillar of the community and an inspiration to other survivors of betrayal. James opened his desk drawer and removed a photograph. Himself and Laura on their wedding day, young and happy and still believing that love was enough to protect them from the world's cruelties. He studied her face in the picture, radiant with joy that had seemed genuine at the time, but now felt like the first lie in a relationship built on deception. For a moment, he almost felt something that might have been regret. Then he remembered the hammer falling toward his skull, his wife